Hello, this is Walter Steimel. Welcome to Module 4 of Information Security CSC EE 565. This lecture will concern frustration, verification, and recognition programs to help protect networks against attackers and help protect and verify the security of systems and information. Last week, we reviewed a number of methods for deceiving attackers. Some of the methods are designed to frustrate and deter casual attackers. Others are designed to learn something about an attacker or frustrate a sophisticated attacker. Some simple strategies deter opportunistic attacks. However, no deception strategy deters a professionally determined attacker, which is the reason for this next module. There are some attackers who will always get through any deceptive technology, and one needs to find more sophisticated and different box of strategies to deter these attackers or protect information. The benefits of strategies must be balanced against the cost and commitment of resources, as we discussed last week. Some questions should be asked when evaluating what the best solution is. Can the solution be implemented? Does it fit within the organizational structure or the capabilities of personnel? Are all of the developers in the company on the same page? If developers have different ideas or different programs, they need to be brought together and agree on what the rules will be. And the rules need to be rules that can be followed. One needs to look at whether or not what your challenges are and whether or not what you're choosing is the best and most efficient or cost-effective solution. You need to evaluate technologies to determine whether or not they interfere with productivity. And if systems are too complicated, people will try to find ways to bypass them. And by bypassing these systems, you can actually make your network less secure. Bypass systems provide a false appearance of security. One may think that the network is secured against attacks, and someone has opened a window to let the attackers crawl in a different way that's not being watched. Chapter 5 discusses technical controls to block attacks, while Chapter 6 discusses information and systems verification. Chapter 11 is an extension of Chapter 6, and you should read them together. Chapter 11 is a fairly short chapter that simply fleshes out the information in Chapter 6. Among the things that we will discuss in frustration strategies are verification checks to determine whether or not data in transit has been corrupted, verification to determine whether or not unauthorized changes have been made to programs or data sets, and using verification systems and log files to determine whether or not there has been an intrusion or an attempted intrusion. Some attackers will not be deceived even by the most advanced systems. So there are some very easy technologies one can implement right off the bat that make systems more secure. One is the disabling of unnecessary services. Unused ports, services, and configurations should be closed. There is a lot of equipment is shipped with extra ports that no one uses, or services and configurations that some people might use but that you do not. Those need to be identified and closed. You should only leave open ports and services that are useful to your enterprise and close the rest that were provided by vendors to other companies. For example, Open Telnet and FTP access ports, when not being used by an organization, are an open invitation for attackers to come into the system. An old example that I've run across a number of times are open maintenance ports on PBXs that were operating in a traditional telephone system TDMA environment. The maintenance port was usually installed by a vendor for their own convenience so they could provide remote maintenance on equipment and cut costs. They wouldn't have to send personnel out to a site to perform simple maintenance and reprogramming or firmware upgrade work on a PBX. In many instances, the buyers may not have known about the ports or didn't have access to them because they were supposed to be secure maintenance ports back to the vendor. Telephone company charges, their tariff price sheets, always levy responsibility for calls on the originating company or person. When hackers seize control of a port in the PBX, they can re-originate long-distance 900 and international service calls for a port for which a company could be liable. Closing these ports became a critical component in preventing hackers from stealing telephone service through these PBX ports, maintenance ports that should have been closed. Module 3 covered network documentation, and I want to reiterate that overworked IT managers may not document networks, protocols, permissions, and passwords. It's important, of course, to keep passwords in encrypted password vault or file, but it's equally important to keep documentation updated and make sure that more than one employee has access to those and is in charge of maintaining those in an up-to-date fashion. You can have, besides an overworked IT manager that simply finds no time to update these files, you can have an employee who wants to make themselves indispensable by maintaining the only copy of network documentation. When they're fired, then they use that as leverage to try to get extra payments from the company. A great example was one that occurred in the city of San Francisco a few years ago. An employee built their fiber WAN network for the entire city. When he left, he kept all the passwords, permissions, and configuration information, and the city had to hire outside consultants to completely rebuild the network from scratch. I've given you a URL to report on the case. The worker eventually was convicted and sent to prison for doing this, but it would have been completely avoidable if the city had simply had duplicate supervision and duplicate copies of the configuration files. In another instance, I worked on a chief information officer, CIO, at a client company failed to keep network documentation or a locked password vault. Part of that was because this particular person was completely overworked, but that person also just wasn't very good at maintaining records. Most of his records were scribbled in notebooks that he either kept in his car or at his house. After a pay dispute, he left the company and demanded additional pay in exchange for the network information. Well, it turns out that he actually didn't maintain the network information except for these scribbled notes and wasn't willing to try to rebuild the network architecture and remember all the passwords. And because of the breach of trust, the company couldn't rehire him to come back and build it because they didn't know what other harm he would cause the network. Furthermore, it's impossible to track an intruder if no map of the network is kept. If you don't know where devices are, where the protocols are stored, what devices speak to each other, and then you've got some unusual usage on the network, it'd be almost impossible to track whether it was authorized and where it was coming from unless you could reference a current network map. So this is a great place to pause. I encourage you to go check out the URL in the previous slide on the San Francisco case. It's a short article, and I think you'll find it amusing, but it certainly drives home the point of having a network documented and making sure that you've got duplicate secure copies of network documentation and passwords. And when you return, please move on to Module 2, and we'll continue, or to Part 2, and we'll continue this Module 4. Thank you.